don't give up. This is where people do usually give up. When we start New Year's resolutions, this is always the case with me and maybe you as well. We're off to a good start, but we don't carry on, we don't continue, we don't get to the end, we don't get to the finish line. So I just want to remind people to, remember why you're doing this. And you're going to have different reasons for that, of why this is important for you and for your organization. Why is it important to manage internal obligations well? And so don't give up. We're going to help you. We're going to help you find the way. And perhaps this is a clue of where we're going in an upcoming challenge. One of my favorite books is The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit books. And there's a quote in The Lord of the Rings by Gandalf, one of the wizards, and he was asked about the hobbits and why they're important. And so he answers it this way. He says, Saruman, who's one of the evil wizards, believes it's only great power that can hold evil in check. But he believes that's not what he's found. It's the small, everyday deeds of ordinary people that keep the darkness at bay. It's the small, daily things that are really important. And when we talk about continuous improvement, we talk about lean as we apply that to compliance, this idea of small daily improvements. We've been going through that a little bit through the challenges, but continuing from here in small steps that are done on a daily basis will produce remarkable results and will keep you in compliance, always in compliance. So something to think about. Okay, so let's talk about what your next challenge is going to be. The topic of today's stand-up call is incorporating obligations. So what do we do with the information that we've collected? We've got our sources, we've got a portion or a selection of the internal obligations. Well, you're going to want to do something with it. And the first thing that people do, and it's a good thing, is to put them somewhere that they don't lose them, that they can keep track of them. And we put them in typically what is called a obligations register. You could call it a legal register. That's where some of it began. But more generally, we call this an obligations register. And they'll look different depending on the domain that you're dealing with. So environmental health and safety, legal, safety and security, pharmaceutical, med devices. You're going to have a different way of looking at it. There'll be some information that's going to be slightly different that you want to manage, but generally speaking, it's a database of keeping track of all your obligations. And some of you may be using Excel spreadsheets. Some may be using more advanced tools like databases or platforms to help you organize and manage your internal obligations. But the goal and the purpose are the same, is that we need some place to put our information. And this speaks to the next component of ISO 19600. This has been our reference, it's been our guide through the ascent so far as we've been going through and getting further up the mountain of internal obligations. So here we're dealing with, and I'm going to refer to the second to last bullet, which is that organizations need a way of documenting their compliance obligations that's appropriate to your size, complexity, and the way that you do your business. So an obligations register is a place where you can document your obligations. And this will, done properly, will help you to manage them as well. So we have identified a number of different attributes that apply to the sources of obligations. Here's what they look like. We've got, what's the kinds of source, the regulator, the domain, the particular concern that the compliance commitment or regulation is dealing with. We've got different ways of classifying the kind of regulation or the kind of compliance. You can look at it that way. Compliance and regulations are like two sides of the same coin. And then we've got what kind of demand it places on an organization. And it could be a one-time demand, or it could be a continuous, progressive demand to continually improve. And so we've got that as well. We've identified a number of attributes that are associated with the obligations themselves. Regulations create obligations, things that a company is obliged to do. And we've talked about this, and this was your goal for the last challenge, was to capture these things by looking inside of documents. And you may have looked inside of policies. That would be a great place to look for internal internal obligations. They're not the only place, but that is a primary and perhaps foundational document to be looking at. But they can come from a variety of different places. They could come from the external side of regulation. We talked about how that could manifest itself as internal obligations, and as well as other sources to look at. So this is what the obligations were looked at. We looked at part of this. We'll be looking at the risk component in the upcoming challenge. But for now, we need some place to put these obligations so that we can manage our obligations. That's the goal. It's of some value to have a list of the obligations, but it's even better if we can use that information to meet our obligations more effectively and more continuously. And here is a process diagram. This comes from ISO 19600. We're still in the first block, so that's okay. That's okay. All right. So let's just kind of work through this a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is talk about a progression of information and the kinds of tools that you might need to deal with that information. So let's talk about the first kinds of things that we're trying to get our arms around, our hands around, which are the obligation sources themselves. And they have a number of characteristics, qualities that you are no doubt discovering, right? And this is true for external as well as internal. They're numerous. They come in a variety of different formats. They will have overlapping concerns. So some will have safety, some may have quality, some may have both safety and quality. Some will use different approaches to dealing with regulation or self-regulation or compliance. Some may be in different languages. Some may be in different jurisdictions, and some will have different impacts or possible impacts. Some may be shared. So there's a lot of touch points here to consider. And so that's kind of the characteristics. This is what obligation sources look like. And so the first thing that we did was to take these and translate them and map them to our own language. We internalized them. So in a sense, internal obligations are in fact a set of all obligations that we want to contend with. And so this is really important. And this is where a risk and compliance expert can be extremely helpful here, someone who can understand how to do this mapping. And what are we mapping to? Well, we're mapping to obligations. So this is what you worked on last week. And these will have a different set of qualities or characteristics that are important. We've got qualities that they should be applicable. That's really one of the most earliest kind of decisions, is to look at all the obligation sources and determine which ones of these are applicable. And well, what we learned this morning from Darby was that well, they also need to be relevant. They need to be up to date. They need to be accurate. They may no longer be applicable. So that's important. They need to be clear and concise. So when we're translating from the obligation sources to our internalized view of it, we need to interpret what we find, perhaps, and make it more clear and concise. What is it that we're actually going to be doing here? What's the promise that we need to keep? So it needs to be understandable. And many times the documents we're dealing with, we're not sure. So we need to use guidance documents. We may need to interact with other people. If it's external, it's a regulator, perhaps. If it's internal, the document owners. What does this actually mean? What did you mean by this? And so that's an important step to take. They need to be traceable. We'll be talking a little bit about this more in a moment, but we need to be able to at least trace them back to the original sources. That's important. But there's also traceability amongst themselves, which becomes important when we look at risk and identifying systemic risk. They need to be achievable. They need to be realistic, right? And they need to be actionable. They need to be something that we can do something about. And so these things, obligations, start to look a lot like objectives. If you've come to that conclusion, then you're amongst many other people that have as well, as that obligations are, in a sense, a set of obligations, and that share these characteristics. So it's not necessarily just parsing the sources and ending up with what the obligations are. That would be the first step, but it's translating that into the language of our company, in our organization, and so that we can understand what the commitment is. But we need to put them somewhere. After doing all this hard work, we don't want to lose them. So let's put them somewhere. So we want to put them in a register. So what would be the qualities of a obligations register? Well, I would think one of them would be, it would need to be comprehensive. You want at least perhaps one place to look for, in terms of where, that contains all of them, both internal and external. That would be good. Well, they also need to be able to be updatable, so we can keep the obligations up to date. So that's what characteristic of the register. We have to find some way of being able to maintain this information. That's important. We need to be able to find things. So searchability is extremely important. And searchability is good. We call that, there's a name for the kind of searching that we're dealing with, so that's called non-deterministic searching. But we also need deterministic searching. That's the connected part. We need to connect things to other things so that we can get the traceability that we need. Different industries have different requirements for this traceability. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry or med device, then you've got a higher demand for traceability, but it also exists in other segments as well. We need to be able to connect other things to each other. So obligations may be connected to other obligations, and that's important. They need to be accessible. They need to be transparent. One of the things that people often say is, we don't know what the obligations are. It's not something that people tend to share for some reason. It's not something that they readily give to people across their organization, but probably they should. That might be a good thing, is that people should know what they're committed to. And of course, the register needs to be something you can rely on, especially when you do integration and you connect it with other things. You want something that is reliable and all those kind of related characteristics. So that's the qualities of an obligations register that you might agree with or not agree with, but these are the things we think would be important if you're going to place these obligations into that system. And well, okay, that's important too. But as I started off, you just don't put them in a register so you have a list and you can report on the list. That's of course part of it, but you also want to manage them. And the meeting of the obligations is usually not done by the compliance personnel. That's usually done by the business. The business is usually responsible for meeting obligations and following the controls and following the way things that are prescribed. And so this is usually requires more of a business expert in combination with a risk and compliance expert to kind of translate this. Well, how does this actually work in principle or throughout the organization? And you may then find that you're now want something in addition to a register. You might also want a system of processes that help you to meet your compliance. And you're going to have processes all over the place: quality processes, safety processes, control process, risk processes. And so you need a system to manage this, and well, they will have its own characteristics. So we're not going to, our focus here is on the third box, which is the register. But our goal, always looking forward, is what are we going to do with this information? And how does this actually get incorporated into our organization? What we've got here is we've got a kind of a flow chart or a diagram that kind of shows the connectedness of things. And you know, we've been looking at environmental obligations as kind of our case study for this 40-day challenge, but you're gonna have different perspectives, of course, in different domains that you're using. And so in Canada, everything tends to flow from the Environmental Protection Act. You know, that's the place that we, you know, things kind of begin, and then that ends up manifesting itself as a compliance agreement, a ECA, for businesses to they need to, it's kind of a contract that they agree to follow that would allow them to maintain a regulatory license. So we've got these kind of connections going this way as well. And then the agreement will have lots of different things prescribed in it. Some of them will be duties and responsibilities. Some will be documentation and reporting. Some will be performance agreements. It really depends on what you're doing. And so they're going to use all kinds of regulatory mechanisms inside of an ECA. So it's actually it's a very useful tool. So it's a good way of doing it. And it's risk-based, so it's different for every organization. So they tend to look at it that way. And you may then choose to implement that through some kind of an environmental policy that says that you're going to commit to achieving that agreement. So in a sense, looking at it in the reverse, the policy is what ensures that you meet the agreement. That's what you're doing. And that policy is going to have, you know, a number of different obligations that you're committed to following. So this is kind of the details. And each obligation, well, they may have objectives. So they may be, you know, an obligation for meeting all legal requirements. So that's this one here. You may have another obligation that's connected to achieving a certain reduction target for carbon dioxide. And so you've got another one over here. So you can see how these are connected. But they're also dependent on one another. So this is something that the siloed approach to compliance creates an opportunity for what we would call systemic risk. So we're focused on the parts, and we forget about how the parts are connected to each other. And so just in the quick example that I've got here is we've got an objective that depends on another objective that comes from the occupational safety program, let's say. So, we need to operate within, safety limits or risk tolerance levels. So that's kind of another kind of obligation that depends on something else. And then with that, well, we have to make sure we follow safe work practices. So these are standard operating procedures, which may be part of a quality program. And so we've got this dependency that goes all the way over to the quality side, if that's where you manage your standard operating procedures. So we've got this kind of connection going on here, and of how the obligations may be connected to objectives, and objectives can be dependent on one another. And the question is, well, what do you do with all this? To start with is you need an obligations register. So you need some place to store the obligations. That would be the minimum, right? That would be good. But if that register also allowed you to keep track of objectives that are connected to the obligations and how those are connected to one another, then that gives you some additional information to help you manage them. And so you can do some things like identify and manage dependencies. One of the largest areas of risk is in the things that are between, not the things that are within. So we're pretty good at doing safety, we're pretty good at doing quality, and pretty good at doing environmental, but we're not very good at how these things connect to one another. And that's, if you read a lot of the new safety documents coming from high-risk industries, they all talk about this part, which is how things are connected to one another. And it's a result of having silos, is that we don't have those interconnections well understood. And of course, you're going to have overlapping objectives, and that's creates a problem. It could, if anything, it creates the possibility for doing duplication. And who's got time for doing things twice, right? So you don't want to do that. So you can eliminate some waste here. And the thing which is really important thing that you can do is you can start to identify shared resources or shared capabilities. When you start looking at, especially looking at ISO 14000 and for environmental, and you look at 9000 for quality, and then occupational safety one as well, you find out that there's some common threads there, and there's some common management capabilities and understandings that you can apply across the board. And so instead of kind of managing things by the parts, which kind of grow exponentially, you can do some synthesis and bring it into a way of having common capabilities and common resources to help you get your handle around all of this and manage them more effectively. Ambitious goals for a register, no doubt. A register is only probably going to start you off with at least a list of obligations. But if we think about it, if we keep track of the tasks and the objectives, well, maybe that'll help us too, to do some of the things that we talked about on the side here. There are 3 steps that you will probably take in this upcoming week, which is dealing with incorporating or including the internal obligations in your existing register. That would be a place to start. And so you'll probably want to go through some kind of assessment of the condition of your current register. What capabilities do you currently need? Is your register up to date? Is it able to be maintained? What's the limitation there? Is it technology? Is it resource issues? And so on. And are you able to know the status of your compliance? In real time, maybe that's what you want to do. So when I look at an obligations register, be great to know whether you're in compliance. And when you're dealing with internal obligations, it's more than just recording the number of days in a 40-day challenge. It's how much progress have we made. So when we think about status, even status becomes a little bit more nuanced than just a yes or no, we're complying or in compliance or out of compliance. We're now looking at trying to communicate progress. You're then going to want to do some kind of analysis to say, okay, well, what's not there? What needs to be there to properly manage internal obligations? And I've been hinting at that you might need to look at some other fields to help you track them. You might want to look at dependencies with other obligations and objectives. So, and maybe you don't have that with what you're currently using. And you, of course, are the qualities of a register that we talked about before. You know, it's up to date and so on. So you want to do some kind of analysis. And then third is, well, what steps could you take to improve your situation? So you may not be able to put your internal obligations in your register yet because you need to do some work on the register first. But maybe it's okay. Maybe you're ready to go and you can just start using what you have. And that would be good too. So those are kind of a outline for how you might tackle your next challenge. So here is your challenge number 3. Challenge number 3, the novice level, is to identify the steps that you need in order to incorporate your internal obligations, the ones you figured out from challenge 2, and incorporate them into your existing register. So basically coming up with your plan from the previous 3 steps that we just walked through. So what steps do you need to take? The intermediate level, well, you may be able to execute that plan, or maybe you don't have to do very much, and you can start to put internal obligations into your register. That would be good. So that's a little bit more for you to do. And then the last level is, okay, you realize that you've really got some work to do on your register, and maybe you're using a spreadsheet or some other kind of document format to manage them, and it's really not going to work once you start dealing with internal obligations, and you may want to put some effort into figuring out how to do some kind of a centralized approach to this, a database or some technology that you could use, like Mnemonic has the technology there to do that as well, but there are others also in the marketplace. So that's the expert level, is to do kind of an innovation on your register. And maybe that's what you need. Maybe that's what you need. Okay, thank you everyone and good luck. And we'll see you at level 3.